Welcome, everyone. While church is still letting out a little bit, let me go ahead and make some announcements and some welcomes. For those of you who are visiting with us, we'd love for you to be on our mailing list, which is every Thursday email blast, which goes out to everyone saying what we're going to be doing here and in church on the following Sunday. If you would like to be on that mailing list, we have yes, over here we have clipboards with green pieces of paper. We'd love to have your name and contact information, and we'll put you on our mailing list. We also would love for you to pick up a red welcome bag. The welcome bags are at a red welcome table right outside the main entrance of this building, as well as on the edge of the campus, and that contains all sorts of information there. If you would like to financially support this amazing, wonderful institution, this experiment in Christianity and all sorts of other things, we'd love to have your support, and you can get a pledge card at any of the tables on the lawn. The action today, we put our faith into action at All Saints Church, and at the action table, you can go and sign a letter of gratitude to Senators Feinstein and John McCain, thanking them for insisting on the CIA torture report coming out this past week. You also can join us today for a Justice for All march. We're joining First AME Church of Pasadena, a very brief protest march on the sidewalks. Will wind up at City Hall for prayers and vigil and speeches. And we'll gather a little bit before 2 o'clock right here on our own lawn at All Saints Church, and then take off around 2 o'clock. So we also have people standing at the exits available to give you an Advent and a Christmas card, which shows you the schedule of all of the upcoming events at All Saints Church during these holy days of Advent and Christmas. We are so very glad you're here. So we have available for, yes? There she is. We have available for sale the book by our wonderful guest today, The Crooked Mirror, a memoir of Polish-Jewish reconciliation. We're going to be talking about it in just a second. It is an amazing and wonderful read, and I commend it to everyone. Be great gifts for yourself and for other people. So, let me sit and welcome. It's so nice to have my friend here, Louise. Louise and I are friends of the soul, and we got to know one another at Aloud, where she is in charge of the literary and performance series for the Library Foundation of Los Angeles. She's been there for the last 2 decades, started when she was 16, and she also coordinates the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities at the University of Southern California, a little school here in town called USC. And she's the author of award-winning memoir, The Souvenir, A Daughter Discovers Her Father's War, and The Knowing Body, the artist as storyteller in contemporary performance. But now she has this amazing book, and she's going to tell us about the story of it. But I would love it if you would warmly welcome Louise Steinman. So, my friend, this is an amazing story, and it's clearly so personal. It clearly is something that took you into a place of challenge, enchantment, growth, transformation. And by telling it, you are telling us something about our own family's lives and also your family's life, and how we all have this business in common about the need for reconciliation.
Yes, sometimes. Can you hear me okay? Are we on? Good. You know, sometimes we carry these stories in our own family lineage. We don't even notice them. They're so much a part of the air we breathe. And first of all, I just want to say I'm so honored to be here, Ed. I was in the sanctuary, and you are an activist church because I was here on time because you're moving right through an amazing day. So in my family, part of that lineage on my father's side, which I wrote about in my last book, The Souvenir, was his experience in the Pacific War, which we were admonished never to ask him about. And on my mother's side, I had noticed that whenever the subject of her family's story and of Poland came up, there was an unwillingness to talk about it. And I think as a child, a curious child, you notice those silences. So those were the two kind of wounds that I went into in these two books. And the book about Poland, The Crooked Mirror, kind of evolved over a decade. But it began, and I'll just start there. And
Yeah, please do. I want you to share that story about how it started.
it started with, well, let's see, it's hard to say when it started. You could say it started when I was 11 and my mother, who never made me do anything I didn't want to do, made me watch a documentary on the camps. And I was, it was beyond my comprehension. She was very adamant about it. And the next day in school, as a way of taking revenge, I ripped up the H encyclopedia on Hitler. That was my child's, kind of, and I mutilated a book, and we are people of the book. So this had very serious consequences. But years later, as an adult, I have a very special rabbi who's also a Zen teacher who had participated for 5 years and went again this fall in the Bearing Witness retreat at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where you go for a week, you do sitting meditation on the tracks, you meet in dialogue groups. It's interdenominational, it is international, it is overwhelming. And he called me out of the blue and said, someone has given a stipend for a writer to go, I think you should go. And it was the last place I wanted to go. So that's where it really began.
I do want to just say that we have all these connections, Louise, and one is with Bernie Glassman, who started these Bearing Witness.
Yes, the Zen Peacemaker Order.
So if you'll just say a little bit about that.
The Zen Peacemaker Order does reconciliation work all over the world. The Bearing Witness retreat was their work, which is now carried on, I think, by a Polish contingent. They work in Rwanda. They do street retreats, where people go on the street and live among the homeless for a week to bear witness and to understand what it feels like to be without a home. So this was something that Bernie had done for many years, and it is informed by his Zen practice of bearing witness.
So before you get into the issue of Polish citizens and Jews, can you just talk a little bit personally about your own family and what you discovered?
Yes, so my family came from a little town called Radomsko, and as a child I thought that was a very funny word, Radomsk, it just sounded funny, and people would talk about it with affection, but there was so much discomfort around what had happened, and I knew that there was family who had been lost, but no one could tell me their names, and I thought this little town was just a bump on the map, a little dog patch. And over the course of time, actually right after Rabbi Singer had invited me to go to Poland, it was 2000, before 9/11, and Google was still somewhat new and exotic, and I put in the name of the town into Google, and lo and behold, a memory book of my family's town came up, 600 pages of history of this town. It's passed from the Middle Ages through the Holocaust. These memory books, which exist for many little towns all over Eastern Europe, were written by survivors, by people who left earlier in diaspora, and they were mainly written in Yiddish. So if you didn't speak Yiddish, like most of my generation, we were cut off. But now they're being translated. So I got intensely interested in my town, and through a consortium of people who were researching that area, I was able to find out a lot about my family on these subsequent trips to Radomsko.
So what were the most kind of revealing and enchanting things that you learned about your own roots there?
Well, my grandfather's father was a rabbi. I learned sadly that one of the sisters who was left behind, my great aunt, Fega Konarsko Wilhelm, and her whole family had been deported, but I found her house. I found a cousin of hers, a cousin of mine who lived here in LA, and I also began to be I found the grave of with the help of Poles in the town, with whom I became friends over time. I found the grave of my great-grandmother who lived before the Shoah, who lived and died, had a burial in the town, and I began to realize that I was of this place. It meant a lot to me to find my great-grandmother's grave and the house of my aunt. And then it became increasingly important to me to see if I could find someone in the town who had been a rescuer, perhaps who had not been identified, and that's another one of the strands of the book.
Before you get to the rescuing, though, can you talk a little bit about how the Holocaust was kind of lived out in that town? How were Jews identified? What happened in the process? Where were they sent, et cetera?
Well, Radomsko had one of the earliest ghettos. It was, since it's closer to the German border, it was invaded immediately on September 1st, 1939, and the ghetto was formed almost immediately. People were divided. They were put in the ghetto. They wore a star. There were, like, I think 5 different colors of stars at first, and they were completely separated from their community. The town was over half Jewish. So imagine if suddenly half of the citizens of Pasadena were segregated from the other half. And of course, there were deep relationships between people in the town. It was a town of some 25,000. So these were people's neighbors. And of course, if you spoke Polish, and not everyone did, depending on how Orthodox you were, you had a much greater chance of survival. But not that many people were able to survive because they were sealed off.
And were members of your family taken?
Yes, my aunt and her entire family was deported to Treblinka, which is where we think they were. Some people were shot in the cemetery. There were witnesses, Polish witnesses. I learned later kids who looked through a chink in the wall and saw what had happened. The Germans tried to chase them down, but most of the people were put right on the rail tracks to Treblinka.
It's just a moment that demands a moment of silence. The horrors of that, totally incomparable in human history, just amazing. So thanks for bringing and bearing witness to that here.
And I think to give a name back, this is someone who had no name, so suddenly to say her name, not only here in All Saints Church, Fega Konarska Wilhelm, but I could say it in Radomsko. I could stand on a stage in Radomsko at one of the lovely ceremonies that they organized for me and say, I am a Radomsker, I am from this place. And so it was kind of reclaiming not just a piece of myself, but realizing that it's their history too. And that the really phenomenal thing I think about reconciliation is when you look at difficult history together. When I was in Japan and returned this flag my father found in the Philippines and sat there with the family of my father's enemy. And we looked at that history together. And it's very painful, but there's a great beauty in what is possible for both sides to receive, I think, in regaining those stories.
Before we go to the reconciliation part of the story, can you say a few more words about the rescuers? And have you met them, and what have you learned?
Yes, and I have, if I could show you a picture.
Yes.
Let's see if I can. This is this is at Birkenau. Well, I should go backwards. This is one of the journalists in the town who helped me find the synagogue gate in Radomsko. This is the house of Vega Konarska Wilhelm in the which was then the Radomsko ghetto. This is the rescuer. Janina Bareska was a young widow, her Polish Catholic. Her husband had already died at Auschwitz. He'd been sent there because he was a communist. And this was her 8-year-old son, Marian. Doesn't he look mischievous? As Jack Miles said, mischievous enough to rescue a Jew. This is the family of Barak Offman, who was a distant cousin of mine. I found him in the course of writing the book. This is his wife and 2 children born in a DP camp after the war. And Janina hid Barak and his wife, her parents, and a cousin in her little house. And remember, she wasn't just risking her life. This is the phenomenal thing and why it was particularly cruel in Poland, because it wouldn't just be you were risking, it would be your entire family. You were risking the lives of your children to hide someone. This is Marian, who never told his story to his wife or to his children. He kept it a secret all through those years of communism. When talking about Jewish history or even Polish resistance was completely forbidden in Poland. So Poland is new to telling these stories, to this act of reconciliation. But he did finally, he told his story. His grandson also urged him. This is Marianne showing us where the bunker was, where the Offmans were hidden, also my translator. And this is Marianne receiving the medal from Yad Vashem in Warsaw, which was deeply moving. And then I'll tell you about him later in Lublin.
Can you quickly go back to see, just to show the people who are bearing witness on the tracks? I think that's just to round out the story. It's so impressive about these bearing witness experiences. There's what, yeah. So if you'll talk about those 2 slides, please.
So this is one of the things that you do every day in the Bearing Witness Retreat, is you do sitting meditation on the tracks. Everyone is sitting together. There is a list of all the people who died in the Shoah. It's a very long list from various lists. And every day they would read names from the list, and they would crank up an old siren, and you would sit and you would listen to the names. You could volunteer to hear the names. And it was, I mean, when I thought about going, this was the most difficult thing. I thought, how could you sit there in that enormity? How could you do that? Well, one learns by doing it, and one is supported in community. This is in the barracks. So there were a number of things, and people really helped each other. So this morning in your sanctuary, as I recite, the Lord's Prayer, hearing the Lord's Prayer standing around the ash pond at Birkenau took on an entirely new resonance for me. And there was a priest, a Polish priest, who stepped forward that day. I write about it in the book, and made this apology. And I wasn't looking for an apology. I didn't know, but when he said, I apologize for those of us who were indifferent, which was understandable, but it was a sin. I could feel something. I felt a stone roll off my heart that I didn't even know I was carrying. And it was very, very powerful. So people really reached out at this retreat. And I think it prepared me for traveling throughout Poland. The name The Crooked Mirror comes from a quote from a Polish priest, Joseph Tischner, who was very active during Solidarity. When regarded through a crooked mirror, the face of a neighbor is distorted. And, we grow up with these ideas about the other. If you don't actually meet someone face to face, you can carry that idea with you for your entire life. So sometimes people were meeting a Jew for the first time if they didn't live in a big city. And it helped me understand that phenomenon.
So we need to move on to the reconciliation. So what are the seeds of the reconciliation movement in Poland?
Well, there's a number of people in Poland today who are discovering that they have Jewish roots or they have Jewish families, but some not. This gentleman that I was in Lublin, one city that I went to, and I could end with this. Tomasz Pietraszewicz, he was a dissident theater director under communism, and then after communism ended, what was he going to be dissident against? What was he going to be an activist about? So he started looking at the unknown Jewish history of his town, Lublin. This is Lublin, and this is the Grodzka Gate. And the Grodzka Gate, in the old days, divided the Jewish section of Lublin from the Christian side of Lublin. And the town was, again, almost half Jewish. This is what's left of the Jewish quarter of Lublin. The Nazis bombed it to smithereens. Most of the Jews were deported to Majdanek. And then the communists finished it. It's a car park. Although those houses are all old Jewish houses, and they say they make a minyan because there's 12 of them. And what Tomasz did was, this is just one way of him putting his artistic impulse. He spent years working on this. He laid cable into the car park, and he shut off electricity to the Jewish side of Lublin. So people walked from the Christian side, which was all lit up, through the gate into this vast darkness where light was coming out, and the voices of Jews who had lived there, testimony, people bearing witness came out. So the question often in Poland is, how do you make an absence palpable? And this is lining the Christian side of the town. And I just wanted to tell that last story about, this is a priest, Josh was telling me his story, this is a Catholic priest who found out when he was in his 50s that he was Jewish. His mother gave him to a Catholic couple to save him. And of course he was in this great dilemma. He's living in Israel now, but he lived in Lublin for many years and taught at the university there. And I met him at a Seder in Lublin. And this is part of another beautiful ritual that they did in Lublin, where they had the righteous people who had saved Jews and people who had been saved lining an avenue, and they passed earth down this avenue, and the priest mixed it, and they planted trees in this. They sent it to Israel and planted trees in testimony for those who had, for this idea of reconciliation, for those who saved and for those who were saved.
Before we go deeper into reconciliation, you're talking about his having been a Jew, grew up a Jew. Can you tell the story about the Beverly Hills person you've discovered and what her significance to the story was?
Well, sometimes you find the story right near you, and my aunt Wilhelm, Fega Konarska-Wilhelm, had married into this big family, and then I found that when I was in Radomsko, someone said, Esther Wilhelm Tepper, they're two sisters, one of them lives in Israel, one of them lives in LA, and for a year I kept looking through, trying to find someone and calling people in the phone book with that last name, and finally I found her. So I found a cousin living about 7 miles from my house, and she was just a great character and the repository of stories. Her father was the photographer in the town, and she had some of his cameras there in her house. So sometimes history it's right around you, and you don't even know it. And so much more now, of course, is possible to know because we're connected digitally and because archives are being released that hadn't been released before.
But she too had converted. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
She was saved by living as a Catholic child. So if you lived as a Catholic, you had to learn, how to pray, how to cross yourself, what not to say. And when she was interrogated, she actually had to denounce Jews because that's what a Catholic might have said at that time. And she made it. She made it through. And she actually has a great affection for Christianity, for the Holy Mother, because she feels like that's how she was saved.
Yeah. Mary has this radical, inclusive spirit about her that amazing. So let's go back to the reconciliation, Louise. What are the hallmarks of reconciliation as it's being embodied in Poland now? What does that mean?
I think it means an interest in the story of what's missing. I think it sometimes means grappling with shame. I think it means facing the past very honestly. There was one incident, a very famous incident in Poland in the town of Jedwabne, where there were Poles who, it turned out, according to this book by Jan Gross, it was not the Germans who killed the Jews in the town, it was the Poles who killed the Jews in the town. I would say this was not that common that happened. It was a horrible act, but it ignited a national debate in Poland that had never happened before. And I think this is part of what reconciliation is about, whether it's looking at My Lai, whether it's looking at the CIA torture report. Sometimes truth is a bitter pill to swallow. Who thought I would be quoting John McCain? But it's true, and in terms of looking at our past in Vietnam. So this is happening in Poland now. They just opened the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, which tells the 1,000-year history of Jews in Poland, which has never been told before. So it's not just the years of the Holocaust. This is a community that made deep contributions, that was integrated to some extent and not to others, but lived among Poles, were welcomed by the Polish kings into Poland. So I think looking at the difficult parts of that past, And I think for American Jews who carry a great deal of prejudice and bias towards Poles, it also means understanding what Poland was like under double occupation, under Nazi and then communist occupation, where people were not free to talk about the past. This rescuer never told his story. Why? To me, he's a hero. Why wouldn't you tell? Why wouldn't you be celebrated? So that is another central paradox. Why did you have to be silent about that after the war, which scholars are just now beginning to study? So he was very, afraid of what would happen. Of course, when he did tell his story, now he was embraced by his community. So his worst fears were not borne out. But it might have been dangerous to do in the 50s,
I want to invoke Desmond Tutu at this point, who, of course, with Mandela, oversaw the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which looked at the shameful, very painful. I was present at one of those hearings in Cape Town one day, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking and wrenching to hear these testimonies about the horrors of the apartheid time. And those two leaders, along with many others, they were not alone, just insisted that the truth had to be told. And in order for truth to really come out, you don't get to the truth through torture, you get to truth through forgiveness and reconciliation. And that's what was held out. The second part of invoking Desmond now is that he's often said in many public places, that he thinks that part of the American problem is that we haven't had something similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about what we did to Native Americans and certainly what we did in the slave trade. And that we will really not be free and be able to be an adult nation to embody our values until we go through that process. As an American citizen, Louise, who thinks deeply about all these kinds of things, while you were researching and writing and thinking about this, did you think about the U.S. and what might happen for us that might have the redemptive quality of what's going on in Poland?
Well, certainly, the great article that came out a few months ago by Ta-Nehisi Coates in the Atlantic calling for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the slave trade. I think that's so threatening to people, but basically what he's calling for is a national conversation. And I can't think of anything that would give more, be more healing. It's not going to undo the past. But if we can acknowledge these stories, if we can hear these narratives and own to what we did, I think it would be a tremendous boost for the adulthood of this country. I do strongly support that. Reparations is one thing that you get to that further down the line if it's going to happen, but to actually start a conversation, I think would be tremendous. People often ask me, and they did about the souvenir as well, did you forgive the Japanese? And I would say, they did not do something to me. That was between my father, Reconciliation often falls to the next generations. And reconciliation is a process, and forgiveness can be part of that process. But listening to each other's stories is the first step, and how we're able to see each other. I couldn't say what my father would think about returning a flag he found on a battlefield to a family, but in my heart, I felt he would think this was the right thing to do. And sometimes that's all we have to go on. We can't speak to those who are gone. But I think those conversations would be incredibly a boon for this country, and I hope we can do that. In Poland, it's happening now 60 years after the fact, and it's not too late, but you have to do it.
Right. You're bringing to my mind the story, and stories are so important to retell and to keep working on them until they free us to be instruments of nothing but pure love to other people. But we have a member of this parish whose relatives were killed in the Armenian genocide. And her name is Lorna Miller, and she's given her life over as a survivor's child to be available anywhere. And she's gone all over the world for this, particularly in Rwanda. And she's done an awful lot of work with the Hutus and the Tutsis, after that horrible, horrible moment. Recently, 15, 18, 20 years ago. Is there something comparable for survivors like you of the Holocaust? Is there an international network now working on reconciliation?
Oh, absolutely. There are many. In fact, one of the ones I write about in the book, and I don't consider myself a survivor because
right.
it wasn't my direct parents certainly connected to it. One of my travel companion for the book, who was a survivor's daughter, I met in Wannsee at a meeting of a group called One by One. And One by One is a group that is for descendants of survivors, perpetrators, bystanders, and rescuers. So we were there at this conference with people who had been in the Wehrmacht, as young men, people whose fathers had died in Auschwitz, people who had rescued, and their modus, their way of working is listening one by one. We would be paired, and we would listen. It's really about listening, and it's very, very powerful, and it goes on over time. And forgiveness is not something that is lightly given. It's actually a very charged word. It has to really come from the heart, and it has to come from what someone says. But I saw remarkable things, and I think that, I think of reconciliation also, it's a micro process. I mean, it's yes, there can be big forums and big testimonies, but really it happens one by one, person to person. When you meet someone who carries a prejudice against you and you have a conversation, and you go beyond something, I think that's where reconciliation happens. I mean, we don't mix that much racially in this society. The more we do, the more this will happen, the more those conversations. But we're apart from each other in so many different ways. So I think those conversations have to happen on a one-by-one basis as well as on a civic basis as well.
I've got 2 or 3 other things I want to do, but I must say that last night I'm making a connection that I didn't expect to make. You're so wonderful. You stimulate me so much in my thinking, and thank you, Louise, for being here. But last night, my wife and I and some other people from All Saints were at the Muslim Public Affairs Council convention. And I've been stalking this guy. I put him in my own book, 8 Habits of Love, in my forgiveness chapter, because he had been shot in the face by a man 2 days after 9/11 who was on this drug-induced campaign to kill as many quote-unquote Arabs as he could. This was in Dallas, Texas. And he had fantasized his sister had gone down in one of the towers. And he went around to 7-Elevens thinking that would be the best way to kill Arabs in Dallas. And he killed 2 guys, and then he shot this man in the face. And he still has 34 gunshot pellets in his face. And he actually went face to face and forgave that man and became the person who tried to keep him from being executed in Texas, based on his belief that at the core of Islam is mercy and compassion and forgiveness. And it's this notion of taking in the pain and listening to it and then going face to face, eyeball to eyeball, that really is mature. I mean, that is being a grown-up.
Well, also, I think among neighbors, I mean, I would say from a number of presentations I've done in Jewish organizations that forgiveness for Poland is not it's kind of permissible to hold this, this anger, because often it was, there'll be a lot of forgiveness towards Germany. But I think maybe because Poland is where it happened, because these were neighbors. If you felt betrayed by a neighbor, I think there's even a deeper pain, than by an occupying army. But it's a long road to go, and people often don't want to talk about the book. They want to talk about their own anger. So I would say there's a long way to go, and I hope many people will visit Poland and visit this new museum and be part of this effort, because the Poles are really willing partners, I feel like, in looking at history together now, and that's a really rare thing. There's an opening. And again, what you reclaim by these two people looking together, the Muslim, then they share a story, and also they don't carry a stone in their heart.
I love that image of the stone falling from
I felt
your
it.
heart that you didn't even know. Now, before we open this up, are there any more slides? Because these are so powerful.
Well, I think we ran through most of them. I'll just, there's the Lublin slides. I'll just show you. This is the man, Tomasz Pietrusewicz, who masterminds all these incredible, he calls them mysteries, where he looks at Polish-Jewish history together in Lublin. We saw The Rescuer.
Yeah, I think they did
and
that must be
this
it.
pioneering journalist in my family's town who, in the days of communism, when you couldn't talk about, he was the gadfly. He would talk about my own secret war with City Hall. He wrote 60 articles about the Jewish history of Radomsko, and he translated that memory book. This is my beautiful translator who grew up in the town of Oswiecim in Auschwitz, which is where he learned about dialogue. He's now a PhD student in Jewish history. Actually, he has his doctorate now. And this is my companion, Cheryl, who is the daughter of survivors, who halfway through the story decided she couldn't go anymore. It was too painful. But she was very brave. We went to her family's town, and she didn't find what she was looking for, which was very hard for her. And this is the memory book. I'll end with that. This is the memory book, which is in Yiddish, which is now translated into English. And I found a copy of it in the Simon Wiesenthal Library here in Los Angeles, so I could hold it.
Wonderful. Well, yes, here's a question. Do we have somebody staffing the microphones right behind you? Yep, right there. So, Jean, thank you. And somebody else hold your hand up and we'll get another mic to you so we can proceed. Thanks, Jean.
I hope this is appropriate, but it's not a question, but I thank you so much for being here, because I'll never forget my husband's and my visits to Auschwitz and the other one nearby, Birkenwald. And because we were visiting a friend in Poland who Lou had met through his journalism work for the Los Angeles Times, and they wanted information about all of this, the Holocaust. So I still remember a child's pink dress in the museum, and it may still be there, but I'll never forget.
Thank you, Jean. Is there other comment or question? There's a hand over here. Please, the lady in the red, Nancy Mackey. Nancy, good reading this morning in church, by the way.
Oh, thank you. It was such an exciting passage. Woo. You mentioned in passing perpetrators. Could you talk about the children of the perpetrators, what their involvement is in this? Please?
In the one by one group?
Yes.
Yeah, there was a woman there I noticed who looked quite haunted the whole time. And the last day she finally spoke in the barracks at Birkenau, and she said, "I'm from a small town in Germany. My grandfather was the mayor of the town, and it was my grandfather who issued the order to deport the entire population of the town." She said, "I want this wound never to heal." That's what she said, which I thought was so. She wanted to carry this. She wanted to bear witness to it. I think she was. I think the value of these one by one groups was that she got so much support, she got so much love, and understanding for what she was carrying, but she was carrying it. And I think for the children, for the descendants who are very awake to that, it's a very difficult burden to hold. But I think this process of dialogue is tremendously helpful to them, and I think that they have such powerful witness to to share with us. Another woman that I met at that conference, her mother was in the SS in the Warsaw Ghetto. She's a therapist now, and I would say that if there was she lived in a really gritty neighborhood in Berlin, and I would say if there were ever any anti-Muslim people were going to go out and bash some Turks in her neighborhood, as she would say, it would be Monica who would be on the front lines, with her daughter. So I would say some of these perpetrators' descendants are very enlightened and activist people who are probably more awake than most of us to the dangers of totalitarian, fascism and to giving over to hatred. But it was very powerful to meet them. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I had another question. Thank you so much for all you shared with us this morning. It struck me as you were talking particularly about the Jews who are now Catholics, and through a variety of different means, that identity, that part of this is how we see ourselves. And
yes.
Indeed, when you talked about Rwanda and these roles of rescuer, someone could be a rescuer one minute and a perpetrator the next. And so I'm wondering, there's plenty of academic work on that, but I'm wondering if there's any practical sort of things being done on how we view ourselves, how our sense of identity is impacted in this process, how people can talk to each other by challenging a solitary sort of sense of identity and actually coming to terms with the multiplicity of identities that we all have. Does that make sense?
I don't know academically. I mean, I can only say that.
It's like asking practically. I'm looking for, are there any, you were talking about how conversations, need to happen. Do you know of anyone who's facilitating these conversations, in the United States about all sorts of different, whether it be racism or other issues here as well as the Holocaust? Do you know of anyone who's facilitating these conversations sort of practically
do you,
speaking?
Ed?
I don't. I'm wondering if the museum, the name of which,
Tolerance.
Museum of Tolerance, is doing any
It's
of that.
probably a good place to to start.
That's where I would start.
And certainly I would say I would look up one by one, because they have done some really amazing work around these issues. I mean, there was someone there at that one by one conference, also an Armenian activist, because there's not a lot of Armenian-Turkish dialogue going on. So yes, I think that's and I'd like to follow up on that too, so thank you. Joe Maislish. I'm so honored that Joe is here today. Joe, can I out you, Joe? It's okay. No, Joe was an inspiration when I was here in high school. Joe was a resistor to the Vietnam War, and I have my letters to him that I wrote to him in prison, and I'm very honored he's here today.
Okay, well, thanks. This is the natural place to be. My wonderful partner, Sarah, tells me about what's coming up, and I get to come here. I'm intrigued by a couple of the things that you said more about yourself, and because I think that's a germ that everybody has got in us, and I'd like to know how you cultivated it or whatever, because I think those are the keys to us reproducing what you've been through on these issues, in whatever issues, personal or social, we're involved in. And there are two things here. One of them is notices the silences. You noticed the silences of your father, and you noticed the silence of your mother's family, and that led you on. And then you said, to go to Poland and to Auschwitz, the last place you would want to go. You somehow have a habit of going to the last place, both mentally, spiritually, and physically. And I think we need to make that contagious. How do you propose that we catch that beautiful disease?
Oh, Joe. It's such a good question. I would say my parents and my childhood rabbi set a great example. I mean, I remember when my little brother got into a fight in Culver City Junior High School with a Muslim student. Someone called someone a slur. And my mother got a notice that said that they were suspended for a day, and my mother got a notice that said my little brother's name was going on the Central Juvenile Index. She went, the what? And my mother, and my father took that on with the ACLU, and they made sure that Culver City was not going to be a party to, something that was going to put a kid's name on. So, I mean, I think that spirit of go into it. And my mom was kind of a fiery character. The obsession thing, I don't know. I mean, it's once I latch onto an idea, it kind of won't let me go. It won't let me rest. I mean, really, I didn't want to go to Poland, and yet it seemed like it was calling to me. So I guess it's like, how do we cultivate listening to what calls us? I mean, look at Ed. He's been called. You were called to do uncomfortable things. So I guess it's cultivating listening. Would you say, Ed?
Yeah, and listening to the voices within. I mean, I spent 8 years in a psychiatrist's office to find out that my problem was that I was not listening to the genius within. So, that's the way you get to be as sane as I am. And listen, I have to say, and we've got to quit, the rides told me that you were in school with Bear and Sally.
That's right.
Ride, and Bear's a member of this parish, and she's watching from streaming, so it's
Hi, Bear.
wonderful to have you connect with them. Louise, thanks for being with us. Louise will hang around. She's already been to church, so she can hang around and sign books. If you'll simply come over here and buy them, and she's available. Will you please help me thank Louise Steinman for being with us today?
Ed, thank you so much. Love you.
Love you too, baby. Love you.